You are listening to The Waiting Woman, Pemberton Manor, Book 4, written and narrated by Becky Dowdy. Chapter 1. Stella Carnegie chose that day, that hour, that moment to lift the mini-blinds at the window above her diminutive writing desk. It was 3 weeks until her birthday, and her thoughts had wandered like untended sheep all day. The stack of stationery stared blankly up at her, but the words simply wouldn't spill from the pen she held poised over the pages. What news in her life was worth sharing with anyone, especially someone like Belinda, Roger's sister, who had everything a woman could possibly want and more? Stella's life, although not exactly lacking, was simple and uneventful by comparison. A movement out on the street caught her attention, followed by a frightened shriek and raised voices. Giving in to curiosity and the lure of distraction from her obligatory task at hand, she rose to move around the desk so she could draw back the lace panel for a clearer view. On the far side of the street, a woman carrying a tiny baby in an infant sling across her chest clutched the hand of a little girl. She waved frantically with her free hand, calling after a man running down the sidewalk to stop. No, she was yelling, "Stop! Thief!" He was almost to the end of the block, but Stella could clearly make out the lady's purse tucked under his arm like a football. When he disappeared around the corner, the woman crouched down to comfort the little girl, who was now weeping inconsolably and burrowing her face into her mommy's side. Without another moment's hesitation, Stella reached over and snatched up her phone, her knobby fingers clumsier than usual as she dialed the police. When the dispatcher picked up, she gave her name and address. "A young man just snatched a purse from a woman right outside my front window. He was on foot and ran down the street toward Oxford Avenue and turned right." "Can you describe the man?" the woman on the other end of the line asked. "Other than jeans and a dark-colored jacket, I couldn't tell you much. The purse was dark blue." Stella paused, trying not to allow her emotions to confuse her. No, it was dark red, burgundy." She pressed a shaking hand to her cheek, then peeked out at the little family across the street again. "Please hurry. The poor woman and her children are terribly distressed. I need to go see if I can help." After 2 more polite attempts to get off the phone, as the dispatcher was also making sure to do a very thorough job of collecting information, Stella finally cleared her throat and said, "Excuse me, dear, but I must say goodbye. I'll be here when the police arrive, and they can ask me anything at that time." She took a steadying breath and straightened her shoulders. At her front door, she turned the deadbolt and unlatched the chain before stepping into the main lobby. She eyed the lovely old Otis elevator, not for the first time wishing she'd been able to get a 2nd or 3rd floor apartment just so she could have an excuse to ride the thing as much as she wanted to. She knew the ground floor was better for her. On days the elevator was out of commission, she'd be forced to take the stairs, and her right hip wasn't always cooperative with things like that. For purely sentimental reasons, she'd gone up and down in the thing numerous times, especially during the first several months after moving into Pemberton Manor. But lately, she'd been avoiding it, side-eyeing it as she hurried past, not allowing herself to linger on the memories it dredged up. She'd only been in it twice last year, and now it was already March, and she'd yet to set foot in the thing since the new year. Last November, when the apartment on the 3rd floor had opened up, she'd allowed herself to indulge briefly in the thought of moving up there. She would never do it. Her apartment had 2 bedrooms, while the upstairs was only a studio, and there'd be no room for all her trinkets and memories. Besides, she wanted her next and final move to be from earth to heaven. But still, the Otis pulled at her, reminding her of long ago when she'd been a young girl visiting the fairest department store downtown, one of the first buildings in Midtown to have an elevator. Adults and children alike waited in line to ride down to the basement or up to the second floor in an elevator that was so like this one. Even now, Stella could feel her mother's slightly damp hand holding so tightly to hers as the two of them set foot inside it, both of them a little giddy with anticipation and perhaps a bit of trepidation. She could see the wide smile on the operator's face as he asked which floor they wanted, could remember the flutter of her stomach as the contraption lurched into motion. Riding the elevator had made those mother-daughter shopping trips extra special. Later on, she and Roger had continued the tradition, starting their Christmas shopping each year at Ferris's department store, making the elevator an official part of their holiday outings. Once, when they'd been married almost 5 years, Roger had secretly paid the operator to let him take Stella down to the basement and back up again all alone. To this day, Stella still blushed at the memory of the kisses they'd shared on that short, sweet ride together. Sadly, the Ferris's department store had replaced the old elevator with a new, homogenized one the year after Roger died. The carpeted walls and scrolled iron of the old unit were replaced with stainless steel and chrome handrails, and there was no longer any need for an operator once the accordion door was replaced with automated sliders and the crank with a push-button panel. It had broken her heart anew, as though God had capriciously reached down and snatched from her that beloved piece of her husband as well. But then she'd found this place only a few short months later, complete with the Otis still in working order, and she'd seen God's hand at work, weaving together the details of her life. "Maybe one of these days I'll go for another spin," she murmured, as she passed through the lobby to the foyer and out into the clear spring day. Stella wished she'd thought to put another layer on. It was brisk outside after the warmth of her cozy apartment. She was always cold these days. She hurried down the walk to the gate at the front of the property, fumbled momentarily with the latch, but stepped out onto the sidewalk just as the woman across the street finally straightened up. She still spoke soothing words to the sniffling child and brushed back a few curls that clung to the girl's tear-streaked face. Stella checked the quiet street for cars before crossing to them. "I saw what just happened, dear. Are you all right?" The woman lifted her gaze, and Stella saw tears glistening on her cheeks, too. "My purse," she said, tipping her head in the direction the man had fled. "It kept slipping off my shoulder while we walked, so Itzy offered to carry it for me. That awful man." Stella could tell she was trying to use discretion in front of the little girl. "Grabbed it off her shoulders, nearly knocking her flat." The woman's voice shifted as she grew less frightened and more angry with each sentence. "If I hadn't been holding tightly to her hand—" The implications of what might have happened were starting to settle in, and the little mother's chin trembled. "He must have been following us for a while, watching us," she said. What if I hadn't been holding on? What if he'd grabbed her?" She broke off completely, her mouth clamped shut, her eyes wide. Stella reached out to put a hand on her shoulder. There, dear. Everything will be all right," she murmured, and then turned her attention on the little girl. "Your name is Itzy?" she asked, not waiting for the child to respond. "Well, you, sweetie pie, are very brave. Are you hurt?" Itzy lifted her eyes to meet Stella's and shook her head. "No, but I'm mad, I'm telling you. That bad man stole my mommy's purse from me." "I know. What he did was terrible. But I'm glad you're not hurt." Stella locked eyes with the woman again, then peered down at the infant, who was somehow still sound asleep in the sling, his cheeks squished plumply against his mother's sternum, tiny mouth moving in a rhythmic sucking motion. "What about you two? Are you hurt? Your baby?" No, we're fine. Just a little freaked out." The woman smiled bravely. Stella held out her hand. "I'm Stella Carnegie. I live in that building across the street. I've already called the police, and they're on their way now." The two women shook hands. "Thank you. I'm Lucy, and this is Itsy and Ollie. My phone was in my purse." Her words trailed off, and she made a sound halfway between a groan and a growl, heavy with frustration and worry. "I don't have a landline, and I have to call and cancel things. I just didn't think I'd need one." Lucy smoothed Itzy's hair back in a maternal gesture that made Stella's heart clench. "Would you like to come inside my place to wait for the officers? You're welcome to make calls on my phone. Maybe have something warm to drink?" Stella had a stash of sweets, too, but she knew better than to offer them to the little girl without getting permission first. "We also live in Pemberton Manor," Lucy began. "Our house is on the 3rd floor, Itsy piped up, her voice a little quivery after her tears. "Our neighbor is Miss Sarah." "Oh, I know Sarah," Stella said to Itsy. "I bet she's a terrific neighbor." "She's a teacher," the girl said with wide-eyed reverence. So this woman and her 2 children were the new residents in the tiny studio apartment on the 3rd floor. And Stella had been worried about not having enough room for just her and her things? How did Lucy manage? Was there a husband, too? "Well, the fact that we live in the same building makes us neighbors, too. How about it? Come in and sit for a spell? I was just getting ready to put a kettle on for tea." She held out her hand to Itsy, who waited for her mother's nod of approval before taking it. They crossed the street quickly, although there were no cars coming and going, and pushed through the wrought iron gate into the large landscaped yard. As they passed the huge fountain on the way to the front entrance, Itsy tugged on Stella's hand. "You gotta dip your fingers in the water, Miss Lady. It's really rather stimulating." Her R words came out with W sounds. Willy watho. "Stimulating," Lucy corrected. "And it's Mrs. Carnegie, Itsy." "Carnegie?" Itsy said, scrunching her brows together and eyeing Stella contemplatively. "I don't know if I can remember that long name. Besides, you don't look like a Mrs. Carnegie. You look like a grandma." Stella couldn't bite back a smile at the child's nonsensical logic. "Why, that's the nicest thing anyone has said to me in a long time, Itsy." "I could call you Grandma, maybe." Itsy shrugged and then frowned. "Except I already have a grandma, and she might be sad if I call you by her name." "I used to call my grandma Lala. It's a little like my real name, Stella, if you want to call me that instead." "I like Lala," Itsy declared with great enthusiasm. "It's kind of like a song, and I like singing." She demonstrated with a quick rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Stars, replacing the lyrics with La 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 La. "Oh!" Itsy broke off mid-stanza. "And it's like lollipop, and you should know I just love lollipops." Apparently satisfied with the label, the child tugged free of both women. "Come on, dip your hands with me, Lala." She dunked her little fingers into the fountain, splashing playfully when she did. "You'll love it. I sure do." "It looks very cold," Stella remarked hesitantly. "Bok, bok, bakok," Itsy clucked out of the side of her mouth. "Itsy," Lucy cried, "stop that." But Stella burst out laughing, too delighted with the girl's forthrightness to be offended. "She's right, Lucy. I am being a chicken." She tipped her head and narrowed her eyes at Itsy. "If you can handle it, little sugar plum, so can I." And with that, she plunged her own hands into the water beside Itsy, gasping at the temperature. "Oh, my stars, child, it's freezing." "No, it isn't. I promise, look," Itsy said, lifting her hands and holding them out for Stella to see.
I still have all my fingers. None of them froze off, see?
Stella followed suit and held her dripping hands up for inspection. Well, bless my soul, I still have all my fingers too, but they sure are cold. She reached out and pressed them to Itzy's cheek, laughing when the child shrieked with surprise. Let's go inside where we can warm up our hands together, okay? I have a pretty little fireplace that won't burn you. She glanced over at Lucy, who looked a little shell-shocked to Stella, not surprising, considering what had just happened. It's one of those electric room heaters. It's quite safe, even for children, and it's very peaceful to watch.
Yes, Mommy, yes.
Itzy tugged on the waist of Lucy's pants.
Please say yes. I want to see the fireplace.
She turned back to look at Stella.
Do you have any hot chocolate and marshmallows? Those work perfect with a fireplace, and maybe a—
Itzy, Lucy interjected again, this time a little more forcefully, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's cheek and turning her face toward her. You are being rude. Stella didn't interfere, but had to turn away to hide her grin. A short standoff ensued. Then Itzy pulled her chin free of her mother's grasp and turned to look up at Stella.
Sorry for being rude, Lala. I didn't mean to. I just get two-sided sometimes.
Itzy dipped her hands into the water one more time.
Mommy says I'm two-sided a lot.
I see. Stella nodded sagely. You're forgiven. I understand how easy it is to get excited about things.
If you come to our house to visit us, you can ride the elevator up to see us. It's quite stimulating, too.
Itzy spun in a slow circle, her hands held out at her sides.
I like that thing, she added.
Stimulating, Lucy corrected again, then turned to Stella. Thank you for your invitation. I really don't want to be a bother. You're no bother, dear, I promise, Stella assured her again. Please do come in and warm up, at least until the police arrive. It'll be more convenient for them to locate you in my apartment, don't you think? They also indicated they'd like to talk to me, too, since I witnessed at least some of what happened and called it in. She glanced at Itzy, who seemed distracted by a tiny blue flower she'd plucked from the edge of the walkway. The child carefully placed it face up in the basin of the fountain and began to blow on it, setting it spinning in the water. If it's all right with you, I do have some hot dairy beverages with, It took a moment, but she came up with a suitable code word. With her fingers making quotation marks in the air, she finished, air-infused glucose cubes. Lucy chuckled. You're good, Stella Carnegie. She smiled warmly, her too-thin face quite pretty when she did. That actually sounds lovely. We really appreciate your kindness.
Hey, I know what that means, ladies, Itzy cut in, reaching up to pat Ollie's backside, leaving a damp handprint on the yellow fabric of the sling. Hot means hot, dairy means milk, and beverages means drink.
Itzy frowned.
Ew, you have hot milk drinks? I don't think I want any of that.
Just you wait, Sugar Plum, Stella said, holding out a hand for Itzy to take. You might change your mind when you see the glucose cubes.
Glucose?
Itzy turned to peer over her shoulder at her mother.
What is glucose, Mama?
It's another word for sugar, Itzy baby. Itzy turned wide eyes back to Stella.
You have sugar cubes?
She dragged the last word out and lowered her voice in awe.
I love, 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 love sugar cubes, Lala. I love them.
I hope you like marshmallows, too.
I love, 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 love marshmallows, too, Itzy declared ecstatically.
Stella worried for a moment that the sugar rush would be more than Itzy, or Lucy for that matter, could handle, but at least the child had stopped thinking about the man who'd snatched her mother's purse from her. Stella, on the other hand, did her best to quell the tremor that coursed through her as the scene she'd just witnessed replayed through her mind, mingling with painful memories of her own. Chapter 2. When the police showed up, Stella gave them her pitifully brief eyewitness account of what she'd seen out her window. Then she stayed with Itzy while Lucy stepped out into the lobby to give her version of the events. Itzy had made herself at home on the floor in front of Stella's little electric fireplace. She had commandeered a few pieces of Stella's stationery and some colored ballpoint pens Stella scrounged up from her desk drawer. The child was busy drawing what she claimed were twin unicorns with sparkling ruby eyes.
"When Ollie gets as big as me, we're going to be twins," Itzy said. "But he's not very smart, so I'm making him a book for him to show him how twins are supposed to be. I have to draw 'cause I'm not so good with my words yet."
Stella thought Itzy was quite brilliant with her words. The child might seem precocious to some, but she was remarkably expressive for one so young. It was apparent that Lucy encouraged Itzy's imagination, too.
"They're really rather pretty, aren't they?" Itzy asked, holding up her paper, her willy watho, a favorite catchphrase of the child's, it seemed, making Stella smile. "Do you see how the wind blows their hair like superstars?" Itzy tossed her shoulder-length curls in demonstration. To be honest, the one-horned, red-eyed creatures with wild flowing manes reminded her of something out of the Book of Revelations, but Stella exclaimed over how creative Itzy was, commenting on how long and glorious the unicorn tails were. Itzy preened under her praise. Lucy returned with her shoulders drooping, the baby whimpering and bobbing his fuzzy head against her chest. "Are you all right, dear?" Stella asked, getting quickly to her feet. She wanted to wrap the little mother in a hug, squirmy baby and all, but it had been so long since she'd reached for anyone, she wasn't sure how it would be received. "Did they have any news for you?" A knock on the door had them both starting in surprise. Lucy perked up and turned to pull it open. Maybe they got him. But it wasn't the police. At Stella's door stood a willy watho, she heard Itzy's voice in her head, statuesque and comely young lady, a look of marked concern on her face. "I just caught the police as they were leaving. They told me you were here," she said, as she stepped into the apartment and enveloped Lucy and Ollie in a quick hug, exactly the way Stella had wanted to. "Gracie!"
Itzy cried out, leaping to her feet and dashing across the small room to throw herself at the woman.
"A bad man stole Mama's purse and the police came and talked to Lala and Mama, and I drew a picture of me and Ollie when we're twins, see? Except we're not unicorns."
The little girl would have continued had the tall newcomer not reached down to sweep Itzy up into a bear hug, kissing her face and blowing raspberries against her neck. Itzy shrieked with delight and locked her skinny little legs around the woman's waist. "I didn't know you and Ollie were twins," Grace said, as she leaned her head back so she could look at Itzy.
"Not yet," Itzy corrected her. "But when he gets my size, we're gonna be, that's for sure."
"I see." She turned to Lucy. "Are you all right? The police told me someone snatched your purse." Lucy joggled the baby in her arms. His whimpers were beginning to sound a little frantic. "Just shaken up is all. He didn't hurt us." She reached out and patted Itzy's back. He grabbed it right off Itzy's shoulder, the jerk. Grace planted a kiss on the little girl's forehead. "You are a brave girl, Itsy Bitsy Spider. What an awful man."
"That's what Lala said too,"
Itzy responded, squirming a little so Grace set her down. Itzy planted her feet wide and propped her hands on her hips.
"I'm kind of like a superhero, I think."
She looked over at Stella.
"Don't you think, Lala?"
Stella stepped forward, ashamed at the wave of what she could only call jealousy that had washed through her as she watched the little family interact with the newcomer. "You're a superstar and a superhero, Itzy." Then she offered a hand to the woman still standing just inside her front door. "I'm Stella Carnegie. Please come in." "Grace Winters. My sister Sarah lives on the 3rd floor next door to these 3, so they're stuck with me showing up like a bad penny." "You mean like our own personal warrior princess," Lucy said, squeezing Grace's arm. "We are the luckiest people in this building, aren't we, Itzy baby?"
"You betcha we are," Itzy confirmed. "And now you can be lucky with us, Lala, 'cause you can be friends with Gracie and Miss Sarah, too."
"I'd like that," Stella said. And she would. She'd felt so alone lately, and suddenly her little home was full to the brim with the sounds of friendship and family. "I'd like that very much." "So would I," Grace said, squeezing Stella's hand with both of hers. "Thank you for looking after Lucy and Itzy and Ollie, Stella. They're some of my favorite people in the world." "I can see why," Stella said, smiling, the envy having passed completely. She found herself drawn to Grace, her openness, her genuine warmth. She wasn't quite brave enough to slip an arm around Grace's waist for a return squeeze, though. Not yet, anyway.
"Come see what I'm drawing,"
Itzy interjected, taking Grace's hand. Grace followed the girl to the little fireplace and sank to her knees so she could see Itzy's artwork. Over the child's head, she said to Lucy, "What did the police say? Did they have any leads?" "Unfortunately, no. Now I have the fun job of replacing everything. Thank goodness my credit stinks, so I don't have a credit card, but I actually do carry all but the kitchen sink in my purse, so I've got my work cut out for me." Lucy snorted and shook her head, then swiped at her eyes with the hand that wasn't patting her baby's back. Ollie wasn't going to be comforted, though. "And of course I have to get a new phone. First, though, before I do anything else, I need to feed this little dude." To Itzy, she said, "Sweetie, it's time to pick up the paper and pens and thank Lala for the hot chocolate."
"But Mama," Itzy began, "Gracie just got here and I haven't even told her about the park yet."
Lucy nodded. "I know, baby, but Ollie needs to eat." To Grace and Stella, she explained, "We were on our way back from the park when all this happened." "I thought you were going to use my phone," Stella said, not quite ready for everyone to leave her alone in her too-quiet home. Besides, the main reason she'd invited them in was so Lucy could make her important phone calls, but the police had arrived quickly, and she hadn't gotten the chance to do so. "You can feed the baby first, and then the phone's all yours." She leaned in a little closer so Itzy wouldn't hear, just in case Lucy had other plans. "And I'd love to have you stay for dinner. I have a crock pot of hearty chicken chowder on and a fresh loaf of bread I made this morning." She turned to Grace. "The invitation includes you too, my dear." Comfort food." Lucy sighed, then ducked her head, her cheeks pinking prettily. She pressed a kiss to Ollie's head and murmured, "I feel like we've intruded so much already." Without allowing herself to overthink things, Stella stepped forward and put her arms around Lucy, her heart leaping at the sensation of holding someone close, of the curve of the baby's head pressed against her chest, his little body wiggling impatiently between them, and Lucy's arm sliding around her waist in reciprocation. The younger woman's breath caught in a half-sob, and Stella squeezed tighter. There, dear. You're okay. Everything will be all right." She smoothed a hand up and down the young mother's back.
"Hey there, ladies and gent-Ollie man. I want in on this huggin' stuff, too."
Itzy wedged her little body between them, and Stella thought her heart might burst with pleasure.
"Come on, Gracie. It's a group hug."
The child thrust a hand toward Grace, who did as she was bid. A few moments later, Lucy stepped back and quickly wiped the telltale moisture from her cheeks. "If you're sure,
We'd love to stay. I really need to feed him, and it just occurred to me that I'll have to call Sean to let us in. The apartment keys were also in my purse."
"Please," Stella said, indicating the sofa. "Make yourself comfortable. Grace, will you stay also?" Grace Winters hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "I'd love to. I just need to make a quick run upstairs and then I'll be right back."
"Are you going to see Miss Sarah?" Itzy asked. She was starting on another drawing of what looked like might be 2 bugs.
Or was it perhaps mushrooms?
"No," Grace hedged, drawing the word out non-committally. "Who you gonna see?" the little girl persisted. "You can give them this picture I'm drawing." She tapped the paper with the pen she held. "It's me and Ollie at the zoo. We're twins, see?" She made a few more swirling scribbles at the top of the page. "We're hippopotamus. Hippopom..." She frowned at her mother. "How do you say it, Mama?"
"Hippopotamus when it's one." Lucy said the word slowly, separating the syllables so Itzy could hear them. "Hippopotami when there are 2 or more."
"Hippopotami, 'cause we are twins."
"Thank you, Itzy," Grace said. "I think I'd better just run my errand quickly and hurry back. But if you want to give the picture to me, I'd love to have it for my Itzy collection."
"Sure thing. I will make it for you then," the little girl quipped, her full attention on her drawing again.
"What are you up to, Grace?" Lucy asked, shooting a quizzical look at her friend. She tucked her legs under her as she settled into the corner of the couch and unwrapped the sling from around her body. Ollie's little fists waved frantically as though he knew what was coming. "Well," Grace began, a sheepish expression on her face. "You know me, Luce. I'm sorta, meddling in people's lives." "But for all the right reasons, right?" Lucy asked, as she held Ollie close, the shape of the tiny head mirroring the curve of her breast. "Of course," Grace shrugged. "The best reasons. I just can't help myself." Stella felt a bit like a ping-pong ball as her attention bounced back and forth between the 2 women. "Well, your meddling has certainly made my life better, so I won't try to talk you out of it." Lucy smiled. "But you will tell us about it?" Grace nodded. "You'll be the first to know, I promise." Lucy's brows rose with curiosity, but Grace said nothing more. Stella's own curiosity was piqued, but she didn't know either of the young women well enough to ask questions of her own. Instead, she asked, "You'll be back for dinner, Grace?" "Give me 15 minutes." Grace headed to the door and then stopped and looked back at Lucy. "Hey, I keep forgetting to ask. Have you heard from Pax?" Stella did not miss the blush that colored Lucy's cheeks, and an appreciative smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Stella had met Pax, the man who lived in the apartment above her, shortly after he'd moved in almost 2 years ago. Although he kept to himself much of the time, his mere presence in the building made Stella feel secure. She'd never forget their first encounter. He'd been so badly scarred and recently released from the hospital after his horrific brush with death, and he'd been careful not to frighten her that day he'd approached her at the front door. She was juggling 2 bags of groceries and a pretty little potted plant she hadn't been able to resist bringing home with her, all while trying to lift her hand high enough to punch in the door code. He'd stayed back, his head bowed a little and slightly turned away, so at first she only saw one side of his face. It was pink and shiny, but not badly disfigured, at least not enough for her to do much more than take notice. He'd introduced himself, showed her his apartment key to reassure her, and then offered to help her inside. Only then had he turned fully toward her. Unprepared for the sight, she had let out a small sound of shock and then put a hand to her mouth in shame. She saw it in his eyes. The man had known she'd react just so, and bore her rudeness with gracious dignity, ignoring both her gasp and her embarrassment, as he carefully took her things from her so she could open the door. Stella had apologized, not with words, as she sensed they might not mean very much to him, but by inviting him into her home without hesitation, and then extending an invitation for dinner, just as she'd done with her new friends today. He'd hesitated only briefly, and then he'd stayed, and the two of them had shared a simple meal of meatloaf, baked potatoes, and a slice of apple pie each. Theirs was a quiet friendship, one built more on respect and proximity rather than shared interests. But in Stella's eyes, Pax was a man among men, scars and all. He was quite a bit older than Lucy, Stella thought, but if the young woman was capable of seeing past the mask of scars to the solid gold heart of the man, and her blush indicated she did, then Stella liked her even more. "Actually, I got an email from him yesterday. The surgery went well, but some of the skin grafting isn't taking as quickly as they'd hoped, so they're telling him it's going to be another couple of weeks before he can come home." Lucy's words came out slightly rushed, almost breathy, and Stella felt the grin on her face widen. Lucy turned to Stella. "Have you met Pax? Do you know about his accident?" "I have, and I do." "He's at a burn center in Denver," she went on. "We were hoping he'd be home this weekend, but it looks like not until the end of the month now." "I missed that man," Itzy said from the floor, not looking up. "He's a superhero too, right, Mommy?" "That he is, Itzy baby." Lucy blushed even more, if that was possible. "Well, we know how to pray, don't we?" Grace said before opening the door. Stella hadn't missed the pleased smile on her face. Apparently, someone else thought Lucy might have a thing for the man in apartment 2A. "I'll be back shortly." Stella left Lucy and her children alone to go prepare for their impromptu dinner party. The soup was thick and bubbly, so she turned the slow cooker off to give the contents time to cool a little. Her loaf of French bread had turned out fluffy and soft that morning, and Stella placed it on a wooden cutting board along with a bread knife and carried it to the cottage-style kitchenette set in the middle of the comfortable space. Itzy poked her head into the kitchen. "You know what, Lala? I'm really rather good at setting the table if you need any help with that." The child lifted her nose and sniffed loudly. "It smells all delicious in here." By the time Grace returned, Lucy was just finishing up with Ollie, who now slouched in her arms in boneless insouciance. "Milk drunk," Lucy stated when Grace laughed and said he looked like he was melting. Stella and Itzy had the table set and soup dished up, and everyone chose a seat. "Can I pray, Mommy?" Itzy asked in what was intended as a whisper. "It's Stella's house, sweetie. You'll need to ask her." "I'd love it if you prayed for our food, Itzy," Stella said, then took the hand the child offered her. Bowing her head, she couldn't resist a sideways peek at Itzy as the little girl asked God to bless each person around the table, the pot of soup, the bread, the pretty dishes, and the hot chocolate already in her belly. "And Jesus, even though I'm very mad at him, please help that man who stole my mommy's purse to see what a bad thing he did and be sorry. Amen." "That was a very kind thing to pray, Itzy," Grace finally said into the thoughtful silence that followed. "Even though I'm mad at him?" "Especially because you're mad at him," Lucy assured her daughter. "Being kind is even harder when you're angry. I'm proud of you, Itzy baby." "Okay," Itzy said, nodding, although a hint of doubt lingered in her expression. Then her eyes landed on the basket of sliced bread. "Please pass that yummy-looking bread. My tummy is already talking about it." Stella handed Itzy the basket, then got up to get the crock of butter she kept on the counter. When she sat down and looked around the table at the little gathering, she smiled, amazed at the turn the day had taken. This morning she'd been so lonely, so alone, and now Here she was with every seat at her table full, new friends sharing food she'd cooked, the voices of young and old mingling intimately in her home. Overwhelmed with gratitude, she was indeed. Lucy interrupted her reverie when she said, "Oh, Stella, this soup is wonderful." The others made agreeable sounds, including Itzy, who nodded her head emphatically, her mouth too full to speak. "You'll have to give me your recipe," Grace said. "Not that I'll cook it myself, mind you, but my mom would love this for our big family nights. Sarah and I have 4 brothers, so you can imagine how handy a huge slow cooker can be." "Of course," Stella agreed, preening a little under the accolades. "I always make a big batch and then have it for leftovers. I think it's even better the next day." Lucy plucked a second slice of the soft bread from the basket and began slowly buttering it. A thoughtful expression settled on her delicate features. In a small voice, she asked, "Stella, why are you being so kind to us? Stepping in the way you did for us today, calling the police, opening your home, sharing your table with us? We were strangers to you, yet you just took us in." Stella paused only a moment before shrugging. "I'd like to say that anyone would do what I've done, but I know personally that's not necessarily the case. When I saw what happened outside my window, I knew I couldn't just stand aside and do nothing." She took a bite of her own soup, it was a good batch, before continuing. 8 years ago, I too had my purse stolen right out from under my arm. It was in the middle of the day on a fairly busy street with other pedestrians coming and going. Out of everyone who witnessed the theft, only one young lady hurried to my side to make sure I was all right. My shoulder had been wrenched painfully, but I knew that would heal. She set down her spoon and took a sip of cool water. It was the loss of what was in my purse that was so devastating to me. Chapter 3.
"What was in your purse?" Itzy asked, her eyes wide. "Did you have precious jewels in there?"
Stella smiled at the child's attentiveness and realized she'd have to choose her words carefully. "No, but I had something else in there that was even more precious than jewels." One of Itzy's curls threatened to dip into her bowl of soup, and Stella reached over to tuck it behind the little girl's ear. "Like I said, it was a busy day, so I parked my car and had to walk about 2 blocks to get to the place I was going. In my purse, I had my last payment for a special box I was picking up that day." She held up her hands to demonstrate an object a little smaller than a square foot. "My husband, Roger, had just passed away 2 months before, and I had ordered a box with pretty carvings on it to remember him by." She didn't want to explain that it was a container for Roger's ashes, and she hoped Lucy and Grace would understand her meaning. "I also had Roger's, memories in my purse that day, in a temporary plastic container, and I planned to have the man who made the box put them in there for me." She eyed Lucy pointedly, and the young mother nodded, her eyes sad. "When the man stole my purse, he didn't just take my money and my wallet and all the other stuff a woman carries around in her purse, but he took those very precious memories of Roger from me too." Itzy furrowed her brow and said,
"But you still remember Mr. Rogers, don't you?"
Then she began to giggle.
"Was your husband Mr. Rogers, Lala?"
Itzy turned to her mother.
"Did you know Lala was married to Mr. Rogers?" she asked,
snickering behind the little hand she held over her mouth. "Itzy," Lucy admonished, "stop it." But she was smiling a little too. "Mr. Rogers on TV was married to a lady named Sarah, like Grace's sister, Actually, like Queen Sarah Saturday on his TV show, remember? She was named after his wife.
Oh,
Itsy said, glancing back at Stella, a glint of disappointment in her eyes.
You would have been good at being Mrs. Rogers, I think, she said. But it's okay. You're good at being Lala, too.
The child reached over and patted Stella's arm consolingly. Thank you, Itsy. Stella felt her heart lift. Without meaning to, the little girl had reminded her of what was important. And you're right. I have many, many precious memories of my Roger. In fact, she leaned forward, lowering her voice for emphasis. You know that elevator out there? She gestured toward her front door and the lobby beyond it.
Oh, yes. I love, 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 love that thing. I make my mommy ride in it with me every single day, even if we don't have to go anywhere.
She sat straighter and lifted her chin.
I even know how to work the crank all by myself.
Well, my goodness. I knew there was something special about you, Itsy dear. I love that elevator, too. I moved into this apartment because of it. I remember the very first elevator like it here in Midtown, and my husband and I used to love riding in it. So when I looked at this apartment and saw the elevator out there, it was like having a special memory of Roger right outside my front door.
Do you ride in it every day, too?
Itsy asked. Stella shook her head slowly. Not so much anymore. When I first moved here, I used to ride in it when I really missed Roger. But I worry people might think I'm a silly old lady if they see me riding up and down in it without going anywhere. She chuckled self-consciously.
But we do that all the time, Itsy declared. No one thinks we're silly old ladies. You just have to ride with us, and then no one will think anything except we're having fun.
You know what? Stella said, pointing her spoon at Itsy. I think I'd like that. Will you invite me the next time you take an elevator ride?
Yes, yes, yes.
Itsy turned to her mother.
Can we, Mommy? Can we invite Lala, too?
Of course, sweetie. What about me? Grace interjected. I want to be part of the elevator gang, too. Even though I don't live here, we should ride it when I come to visit.
We should go for a ride when dinner is over, Itsy declared. Our first elevator gang ride ever.
She bounced up and down in her seat, hardly able to contain her excitement. Sounds like a plan to me, Stella said, feeling a little of that same verve stirring up inside of her. Lucy caught her eye, her expression serious. Stella, elevator rides aside, thank you. Thank you for taking us in, for stepping in and helping us today. I'm so sorry about your loss. What a tragedy. Stella shook her head. No, dear, it's all right. It took me a while to forgive that young man, especially since they never caught him. She grinned mischievously. But whenever I thought about him opening my purse and finding that plastic container of Roger's, memories in it, after I got over being sad and angry, I had to laugh. Talk about a surprise. The contents were clearly labeled, and it must have been quite a shock. Grace chuckled softly. I shouldn't laugh, but that is pretty funny, she said, then added quickly, in a sick and twisted way, of course. I know, Stella agreed. Her cheeks warmed a little. I don't think I've ever admitted that to anyone, but I did get a bit of secret satisfaction at the thought. I hope you won't judge me for it. Lucy grinned and leaned forward across the table. I love it, she said. I love that you can find humor in the dark places. That's not easy to do. Believe me, I know. Hey, Luce, Grace said, her voice lifting with inspiration. You should put that in one of your books. Your books? Stella asked.
My mommy writes books, Itsy explained. "They're all about love and kissing and mushy stuff." She stuck a finger in her mouth and made a gagging sound. "Itsy." Lucy tried to sound firm, but she was also trying not to laugh. "Have you read them?" Grace asked the child. No way, Gracie. I don't read them 'cause I'm too young to worry about that gross stuff."
"An author? Really?" Stella was intrigued. "What do you write? I'm an avid reader, and I may be too old to worry about that stuff, but I like to read about it." She winked at Itsy. "And I don't even think it's gross." The conversation continued from one subject to another as the meal progressed. Stella had made lemon bars the night before, and after the dinner dishes were cleared and the kitchen cleaned up, she put on a small pot of coffee and served the bars up for dessert. The 5 of them rode the Otis elevator up to the 3rd floor, where Itsy insisted Stella get off and come see where she lived. "I haven't done any cleaning," Lucy said apologetically. "It's not a whole lot of space for all 3 of us, and I wasn't expecting visitors. But it's home." Sensing the young mother's self-consciousness, she didn't stay for more than just a quick peek inside. Then everyone rode down to the ground floor again to make sure Stella got back safely. She was moved by their attentiveness, and when Itsy threw her tiny arms around her and said, "I love you, Lala," before darting back to the elevator, Stella thought perhaps her heart might burst with joy. Chapter 4. The next day, still slightly euphoric over the presence of the new friends in her life, Stella sat down to finish the letter she'd started. Was it only yesterday? She wrote to Roger's sister twice a month. They'd become fast friends from the moment they'd met when Roger brought Stella home to meet his family, and the 2 women had stayed true to their friendship even after Roger's death. Belinda lived in Oregon with her husband and their pets, their 3 adult children married and producing a horde of grandchildren for them to dote on, all living close by. It was everything Stella had hoped for herself. But she and Roger had never had children. They'd tried so hard and grieved even harder when they were finally told there was no hope. It had been just the 2 of them for 41 years, and when Roger's body succumbed to cancer, she truly felt like she'd lost everything. Belinda, bless her heart, understood, and although she tried to be sensitive, because Belinda's life was filled to overflowing with her family, her letters were filled with the news of her family too, and were bittersweet to read. Stella wanted to know everything. She wanted to hear about it all. But even so, it broke her heart a little every time she read about how blessed her friend was in ways Stella wasn't. And trying to come up with something new to share with her sister-in-law was always a challenge. Until today. Now she could share about Lucy and Itsy, about baby Ollie, about Grace and Sarah. She'd been gifted with a ready-made family and friends right when she felt most desperately alone. And if she wasn't too far off, she thought perhaps the bird-like Lucy and her children might just need her as much as she needed them. Stella hurried to finish the letter so she could get it to her mailbox before the postman came, and then remembered she hadn't checked her mail the day before, not with all the excitement that had consumed her afternoon. Inside her box was a phone bill, a bundle of grocery store ads, and a peach-colored notification from the mailman indicating that she had a package to pick up from the local post office. There was no sender's name, only an address, and although it was local, she didn't recognize it. She hadn't received a package in the mail for as long as she could remember, except on the rare Christmases when Belinda sent her more than just her Christmas card and letter. Curious, Stella decided to go pick it up right away. She needed to stop by the supermarket anyway. When the woman at the post office pushed the box across the counter toward her, Stella's eyes widened in surprise. It was a fairly large package, about a foot square and rather heavy. In an unfamiliar hand, it was made out to her at her old address. "I'm surprised it still came to me. I haven't lived on Maple Avenue in a very long time, almost 8 years now." The postmistress smiled and nodded. "It is rather interesting. Usually after a couple of years, items just get returned. Somehow this one got flagged with your forwarding address. Lucky you." Then she moved on to the next customer. In the upper left-hand corner was the return Midtown address, but still no name. Something in the mystery of it made her hesitant to tear it open right away. Instead, she headed back to her apartment, skipping the grocery store altogether, and put a kettle on for hot tea. She set the package on the coffee table, but still didn't open it. Instead, she busied herself around the kitchen, preparing her cup and saucer, and taking out one of the leftover lemon bars to enjoy. The kettle whistled, and Stella prepared her tea with a spoonful of honey, then finally headed to her favorite chair in front of her fireplace. Her hands shook a little as she opened a pair of scissors and slid the edge of one blade along the tape that sealed the package. Opening the top flaps, she gasped in stunned surprise when she saw the contents of the box. Nestled into crumpled newspaper was her very own purse, the navy blue leather handbag that had been ripped from her shoulder all those years ago. Resting on top of it was an envelope with the same unfamiliar script from the label on the package. She opened it and withdrew a handwritten missive. 5 $100 bills fluttered to the floor when she unfolded it. She picked them up and set them on the occasional table at her side, hardly looking at them. "Dear Mrs. Carnegie, my name is Arthur Radcliffe, and I stole your purse 8 years ago. I am deeply sorry for the pain and trouble I caused you, and I am asking for your forgiveness. I was in a desperate and dark place in my life, but when I opened your purse and discovered the ashes of your husband, I'm assuming, based on the information on the label, forgive me if I'm wrong, inside, something in me woke up. I did spend your money. At the time, I believed I had no other option, but I could not bring myself to throw away your purse or any of its contents. If it's any consolation to you, and I hope in some small way that it is, your bag might have saved my life. Had I kept on the road I was, I'd surely be dead by now. Since that terrible time in my life, I have made great strides toward getting back on my feet and getting my life right before God. And your purse and thoughts of you have helped keep me on course. Every time I saw it at the back of my closet, I wondered about you, about how my actions must have wounded you. And about 2 years ago, I began praying for you and asking God how I could make things right with you. I don't know if this package will make it to you. I drove by the home address on your driver's license and discovered another name on the mailbox, so it's likely an old address, but I thought it was worth a try. I've enclosed $500 to replace what I found in your purse. Again, I deeply regret my actions, and I know I must have caused you great pain. For all of it, I am sorry. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. That said, you now have my name and address, and I've also included my phone number on the off chance you'd like to speak with me. If you choose to press charges, I understand. I am certainly guilty of this theft and so much more. By God's grace alone, I am free to admit and acknowledge my guilt and willingly accept the consequences. Sincerely, Arthur Radcliffe. With trembling hands and an unsettling shortness of breath, Stella set the letter aside and carefully took her old handbag from the box, the weight of it strangely familiar even after all these years. Unzipping it, she peered inside. There, nestled amidst the paraphernalia of a woman's purse, was the square plastic case containing her husband's ashes. Tears trickled down her cheeks as she lifted it out and held it between her hands. "Oh, Roger," she murmured. She sat thus for a long time as she processed through what this meant. Arthur Radcliffe. The name sounded so proper, so collegiate, not the name of a desperate man who'd snatch purses from old ladies. What was he like, this man who had taken so much from her and then returned it all these years later? Of course she wouldn't press charges. Should she let the police know about the returned purse? Would her case even be open after so long? What did one do in these circumstances? Should she look him up? Wouldn't he want to hear her say she forgave him? Clearly, she'd been a burden on his shoulders all this time. Wouldn't it help him to move forward if she at least gave him the courtesy of a phone call or a letter? "What should I do?" she asked aloud. She picked up the bills with Benjamin Franklin's capricious face on them and marveled again at the miracle they represented. She no longer needed the money, not like she had back then. She'd opted for cremation because a burial, casket, and tombstone were simply out of her price range. She'd scraped together the last of her savings to pay for the beautiful urn, a polished mahogany box custom carved with the Carnegie family crest, with its spread-winged eagle and the words "Dread God" adorning a banner across the top. Stella hadn't worked for most of their marriage, and Roger had owned a custom framing company that had never made them much more than what they needed to live on. Roger had a life insurance policy that would be sufficient to care for her basic needs, but not enough to maintain the house they shared, especially if anything major needed done, such as a new roof or a burst pipe or more. Not more than a year after her husband's death, Stella realized she simply couldn't justify hanging on to their home, and she sold it and rented her apartment here. It had been a good decision, not just financially. Being alone in the rooms they'd shared for more than a quarter of a century had been nearly unbearable, and in her own place, she was finally able to go through the grieving process and eventually begin to learn to live life alone. But now, more than ever, she longed for someone to talk to, someone to give her advice and feedback on this new and completely unexpected turn of events. "Oh, Roger," she murmured again, "what should I do with this?" A knock sounded on her door, and she jumped, nearly dropping the contents of her lap onto the floor. She scooped everything up and set it aside, then rose to go see who it was, although she thought it was probably Itzy inviting her out for an elevator ride. Stella wasn't sure if she was in the right frame of mind for it at the moment, but she straightened her shoulders and pasted a bright smile on her face before opening the door. Grace Winters stood there with her sister Sarah. Stella and Sarah had spoken often in passing over the years, usually short, pleasant conversations at the mailboxes or out in the parking lot, but they'd never spent any significant time together. Still, she knew the young woman to be kind and helpful, and Stella genuinely liked her. "Hi, Stella." Grace's cheerful salutation was echoed by her sister. Stella opened her door wider. "Hello, ladies. It's nice to see you both. Would you like to come in?" Remembering how much Grace enjoyed the dessert the night before, she added in a cajoling tone, "I have a couple of lemon bars left from last night." "Oh, goodness, how can I say no to that? We actually stopped by because I forgot to get the recipe for your soup last night. I was telling Sarah about it and remembered." Grace stepped inside, Sarah on her heels. "We don't want to bother you, but I was wondering if it might be a good time to get it from you now." "Of course," Stella said. Then a thought struck her. Hadn't she just been wishing for a listening ear? Someone to talk to about the box in her living room? Please come in and make yourselves comfortable. Do you have time for a cup of coffee with your sweets?" Sarah and Grace both agreed, but instead of going to the living room, they followed her into her little kitchen and asked what they could do to help. So Stella set Sarah to work on making coffee and Grace to plating up the last of the lemon bars, while she headed into the living room for the box. "I'm really glad you girls stopped by just now," she said as she re-entered the room with her arms full. "I could really use some advice." The two sisters exchanged curious glances and then took the chairs that Stella indicated at the little kitchen table. Stella sat across from them. "Did you tell your sister about my purse-snatching experience?" she asked Grace, not sure where she should start. "I did," Grace said, a look of concern on her face. "I hope that's all right. I didn't even consider that you might not want me to share it. I'm sorry if I've—" No, Stella said, cutting her off. "I'm glad. Then I don't have to tell it all again." She pushed the box across the table toward the two girls. "Take a look at what came in the mail yesterday." She shook her head, still somewhat stunned by it. "Of all days, Grace. I haven't told that story to anyone in years. And then yesterday, I share it with you and Lucy and her babies. And now this." Grace and Sarah eyed the box curiously, but seemed hesitant to open it. "Go ahead," Stella urged. "Look inside, and read the letter." She'd tucked everything back into the box the same way it had been packaged. Sarah opened the flaps of the box, and Grace gasped, then looked up wide-eyed at Stella. That's not your purse, is it? The one that was stolen?" Stella just nodded and waited while Grace opened the envelope with the letter and cash inside. Stella saw that the younger woman's hands trembled slightly too. "Wow, I'm having major chills here," Grace said. She handed the letter to Sarah. "You read it out loud. I'm shaking so hard right now I don't know if I can." Sarah read the letter and then set it aside, both girls gawking at Stella. "Is everything still there?" Grace asked. "Even, Roger?" Stella chuckled. "Well, Roger isn't in there, but his ashes are, yes." She stood and said, "Sit tight. I'll be right back, okay?" Both girls nodded, and Stella hurried from the room. On her dresser was the beautiful urn she'd ordered. It had taken her 2 more months to come up with the additional $500 that had been stolen, but she'd insisted on buying the box anyway, even if it would remain empty. When she returned to the kitchen, the sisters were sitting where she'd left them, but with the letter laid flat on the table, their heads bent together as they read it again in silence. "It's a miracle, Stella," Sarah whispered, looking up at her when she pulled back her chair to sit down across from them. "What are you going to do?" "Is that the urn?" Grace's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It's beautiful." Stella slid the mahogany box over to Grace, then turned to Sarah. "I don't know what to do. That's why I was so glad to see you two. I could really use some advice on this. I'm at such a loss." "Do you forgive him?" Grace asked, carefully sliding the box toward her sister. "I apologize if that's too blunt, but—" She shrugged and watched, while Sarah ran her fingers reverently over the intricate pattern of the crest on the face of the urn. "It's all right," Stella assured her. "That's certainly a significant detail." She folded her hands on the table in front of her. "And yes, I do forgive him. I forgave him many years ago. My question is, what do I do now? Should I reach out to this Arthur fellow? On the phone? By mail? Should I drive by and spy on him first?" She grinned at the notion, but even so she was half serious. "From his letter, It seems like he really wants your forgiveness. It might be a good idea to let him know somehow that he has it." Sarah tapped the letter with her forefinger. "I think maybe a letter might be a good place to start. You can really think through what to say that way, and you can stay in control of the communication." "Yes, I agree. I believe the poor man needs absolution." Stella nodded slowly. "And I think the only way that will truly happen is if he hears it from me, by phone, by letter, or even in person." "I still can hardly believe it," Grace said, reaching for the purse's shoulder strap. "May I?" At Stella's nod, she pulled the bag from the shipping box and set it on the table. "Not only that the purse came back to you, but that it instigated such a drastic change in that man's life. I mean, from his letter, he's an upright dude now. That's huge, Stella. A miracle, you know? Talk about beauty from ashes and all that stuff." She covered her mouth as it occurred to her what she'd just said. "No pun intended, Stella. Sorry." "I know, dear, but that's kind of funny anyway." Stella smiled, appreciating the humor. "But in all seriousness, the fact that he's been praying for me really touches my heart. It's been a while since I prayed for him. I used to do so all the time, but lately I've forgotten. Then hearing little Itsy pray for the fellow who grabbed Lucy's purse?" She closed her eyes, recalling the verses in the 6th chapter of the book of Luke that she'd memorized when she'd been so angry and hurt. "Bless those who hurt you. Pray for those who mistreat you." Sarah, sounding every bit the teacher she was, said, "All righty then. It's decision time, ladies. Here are my 2 cents. Write to him. Tell him you received the package and that you forgave him long ago. I think it will do you both a world of good." "You know, Stella," Grace spoke up, slowly, thoughtfully, "I agree with Sarah. Write to him. But I think you should take it one step further. I think you should meet with him face to face. I think it sounds like he'd be open to that. Yes, tell him all is well in your letter, but then invite him to meet you somewhere in public, but somewhere that you can talk privately, like at a park or maybe at a restaurant with secluded booths." She reached out and put a hand on Stella's forearm. "I'll go with you if you don't want to go alone." "Count me in, too." Sarah's assertion made it clear she wouldn't be left out of the monumental event without a fight. Chapter 5. Stella felt a weight lift from her chest as she folded the letter precisely in thirds and slid it inside an envelope. It was exactly what she wanted to do, and she had such a sense of satisfaction over the decision to reach out to Arthur Radcliffe this way. She'd just needed someone else to say so, to support her. The fact that she suddenly and providentially had more than one person in her life whom she could lean on was a comfort beyond measure. The sisters had let Lucy in on the rendezvous plans, and like Sarah, Lucy had insisted on tagging along. A week from Saturday, the women would position themselves near the fountain at the entrance to the butterfly pavilion in the Midtown Botanical Gardens. Of course, Itsy and Ollie would also be there, since the butterfly pavilion was one of Itsy's favorite places to go in Midtown. "I don't require or even request a response from you, Mr. Radcliffe. I leave the decision in your hands. We'll be there at 4 p.m., rain or shine. I'll have the purse with me, as you'll be sure to recognize me that way, and Itsy, my intrepid young neighbor, will be dressed in a red butterfly outfit. You won't be able to miss our entourage." Stella hesitated before she added, "Should you opt not to show, please rest assured that I will leave well enough alone. You will not hear from me again, nor will I press charges or pursue restitution with you. You have my forgiveness already, and I am content to let that be enough." Much to everyone's surprise and delight, a week later Stella did receive a reply from Arthur. "Stella," the letter began. She'd asked him to address her thus. "Thank you for your kind and quick response. I will be at the Midtown Botanical Gardens to meet you and your friends. I will be wearing a black tweed coat with dark green elbow patches. I look forward to meeting you. Arthur Radcliffe." That was it. No backing out. The deed was done. The tide set in motion. Several days later, the group of women and the 2 children headed out in Sarah's SUV, the only car in their group large enough to safely seat all of them. The sun was out, the sky a whimsical masterpiece of forget-me-not blue and powder-puff dream clouds. Even as nervous as Stella was, the ride to the park was alive with anticipation. Itzy requested they play several of her favorite Taylor Swift songs, including Shake It Off and We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together, songs that made Stella laugh out loud, especially since the little girl sang all the lyrics by heart. The drive went by quickly, almost too quickly, and they were suddenly pulling into a parking space, the music silenced, the engine turned off. Everyone took a collective breath, even Itzy, and then all 4 doors opened, and the women and children piled out. Even though it had been 8 years, even though she had been nearly blind with grief, then impaired by anger and helplessness, even though Arthur Radcliffe was completely changed on the inside, Stella immediately recognized the man who waited for them. Her heart leapt into high gear, and for a moment she faltered, stumbling just a little. But Itzy's tiny hand slipped into hers, and the little girl said, "It's okay, Lala, I got you." Mr. Radcliffe sat on the edge of one of the benches in the shade of an evergreen magnolia tree, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped in front of him. His posture was that of a man waiting, of someone who didn't want to look anxious, but was nonetheless, and Stella empathized with him. "There he is," she murmured softly, not yet ready to draw his attention to them. He was looking toward the fountain, his fingers lacing and relacing together, his heels bouncing sporadically, as though try as he might, he could not sit still. "I see him! I see him!" Itzy declared in as close to a whisper as she could muster while jumping up and down. "I see his green elbows!" In that moment, he saw them too. The man went statue still, and time seemed to stop as the moment stretched on impossibly. Then his shoulders straightened, and in one fluid movement he rose to his feet and stood to face their little party. Stella couldn't help wondering how they must look to him, a silver-haired dame flanked on one side by the Amazonian Winters sisters and the diminutive mother and children on the other. All those female eyes fixed on him. Ollie was passed out in the sling on his mother's chest. "Whoa, Stella," Sarah whispered from beside her. "He's, well?" She stuttered to a halt, then giggled and said, I know he's the bad guy in this tableau, but, wow." Arthur Radcliffe was indeed, wow, as Sarah said. Even with the distance between them, Stella was pretty sure he'd tower over all of them, including Grace. He wore the promised tweed coat the color of soot with its pine green accents at the elbows and lapels, narrow dark blue jeans, the ankles bunched casually over the low tops of brown leather lace-up boots. His dark blonde hair was trimmed close above his ears, but long enough on top to fall forward over his broad forehead in a casual artistic flare, his jaw clean-shaven above an understated mustard-colored scarf looped casually around his neck. His handsome face, Stella realized, was not so distinctive that she could have described his specific features to anyone, yet something about it brought back in vivid detail the moment their paths had crossed so many years ago. She'd only caught a glimpse of it at the time, but as the image flashed across her memory, she thought she recalled his expression as he darted a look back at her over his shoulder. Despair and desperation, self-loathing, and yes, as she thought about it now, apology. Or was it only her imagination adding sympathetic emotions to their last encounter? It was his expression today, however, that turned his nice features into something, well, heart-stopping. Hope mingled with shame, joy shadowed by nervousness, sincerity and genuine vulnerability. He stood before them, completely transparent, and Stella released any last lingering echoes of doubt about meeting Arthur Radcliffe.
"Come on, Lala," Itzy said, tugging her forward again. "He's waiting for you."
Stella didn't know how much the intuitive child understood about the situation, but Itzy's encouragement bolstered her. She took a deep breath, marveling again at the crazy series of events that had brought them all to this place on this day, and then she let Itzy lead the way. Arthur moved toward her, slowly at first, his smile a little tentative, but when she nodded and waved at him, his grin widened in what Stella could only imagine was pure relief, and they met halfway, stopping only a few feet apart. "Mrs. Carnegie? Stella?" He thrust out a long-fingered hand. She took it, and he enfolded hers in both of his. "I'm Arthur Radcliffe." When she saw the telltale shimmer in his own eyes, they were a warm chocolate brown, she noted. Stella felt her own tears well up, and her chest tightened involuntarily. She squeezed his hand gently, not pulling away, and swallowed hard to knock loose the lump that tried to barricade the words she wanted to say. "Yes, I'm Stella Carnegie. It's so good to meet you, Arthur. It's really quite a miracle, isn't it?" Her legs trembled a little, and she felt just the tiniest bit lightheaded. She thought perhaps she should sit down, but then Grace stepped close and rested a stabilizing hand on her back. Stella leaned into it just a little, grateful for the support of her new friends. Arthur didn't let go of her hand, but he held it gently, almost reverently. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. He tried again and blinked quickly, but his emotion got the best of him, and 2 tears slid from the corners of his eyes down over the high ridges of his cheekbones. "Thank you," he finally managed to whisper. "Thank you." Stella reached up with her free hand and pressed her open palm to his cheek, brushing away the moisture with her thumb. "My goodness, young man, I think you've carried the weight of this silly old purse far too long. Come here." Thankful for the practice she'd had with the demonstrative women in her building over the last few weeks, she slid her hand free of his and opened her arms to Arthur. He engulfed her in a hug that might have terrified her a month ago, but today it seemed exactly what they both needed most. Today, as she felt his whole body shake against her with his silent weeping, she fully grasped the power of human contact, how remarkable the sensation of touch was, how important it was to connect physically with another human being. She'd missed out for far too long. Had this young man missed out too? What had his life been like all these years? And what had been the catalyst for the change in him from the man he was the last time their paths had crossed? She wanted to know it all.
"Group hug, you guys! Come on, everyone!"
Itzy cried, shoving her way in between Stella and Arthur, her movements hindered somewhat by the wire-framed butterfly wings on her back.
"Mommy, get Ollie in here too. This hug is a good one."
Poor Arthur, Stella thought, as Itzy cajoled the Winters sisters into joining them too. But she was delighted to hear him chuckle close to her ear, to feel him shift to accommodate her friends. She glanced at Grace over the heads of Lucy, Ollie, and Itzy. There were telltale tears on Grace's face, too, but she was watching her sister with a bold and somewhat calculating grin on her face. Stella followed her gaze and almost laughed out loud. Sarah's cheeks had turned the color of spring roses in full bloom. Tucked under one of Arthur's long arms, her head resting against his shoulder, her eyes were closed. If Stella wasn't imagining things, she thought the young woman was smelling his coat. She caught Grace's eyes, winked conspiratorially, and felt the younger sister's hand squeeze her shoulder in acknowledgement. Grace had said she liked to meddle in people's lives, and Stella thought that might include a little matchmaking, if the look in her eyes was any indication. Well, my goodness, Lord, you certainly have a way of weaving things together, she thought. Chapter 6. As planned, Grace, Sarah, Lucy, and the kids left Stella and Arthur on one of the benches near the fountain so they could speak in private. They would make a circuit of the pavilion and be back in less than an hour. I have nothing to hide, Arthur had assured them all, insisting they could stay if they wanted to, but Stella thought it would be easier on the man not to have an audience, at least not at first, and sent them off to enjoy the pavilion. Besides, she couldn't help but notice how Arthur's gaze kept returning to linger on Sarah. The man looked a bit smitten by the woman, and Stella didn't want him to be any more nervous than he already was. They waved the little troop off and settled onto the bench together. From inside his coat, Arthur pulled out a small pocket-sized book. A Bible. He held it up. My crutch, he said. I'm not fanatical or anything, but having it on me is a comfort. Stella nodded, not at all put off by his admission. That's no crutch, my dear, she told him. That's a sword you're holding, the sword of truth. You're right. Arthur nodded. It is, the word of God, the sword of truth. And then he told her his story. He told her about the group of friends he'd fallen in with as a teenager, how he all but destroyed his relationship with his parents after he turned 18 and left home. He told her briefly about the years that followed, the drinking and drugs, his inability to keep a job, and eventually to even find a job, and the petty theft that became his income. I honestly think that by the time I grabbed your purse right out in the open, I was just desperate for someone to catch me, to put me out of my misery. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands in front of him the way he'd been doing when they'd first seen him on the bench. Stella wanted to comfort him, but she also knew he wasn't finished saying what he wanted to say. So she waited in silence, giving him the space he needed to gather his thoughts. The story of my demise isn't unique, Stella, and I think the predictability of it is what makes it especially sad. I knew exactly what I was doing, exactly where I was heading. I had a wonderful childhood and parents who loved me. I'd heard the warnings about choosing friends wisely, but who's to say I wasn't just as much a bad friend as the others were to me? What is it that makes us do the things we don't want to do, knowing we're self-destructing, yet charging ahead anyway? That question is right out of that book you're holding, Arthur. Stella pointed at the Bible in his hand. Paul writes about that exact same struggle in the book of Romans, chapter 7, I believe. Yes, I've read it, Arthur said, nodding slowly. It's one of the passages in the Bible that makes me believe God really knew what I was going through. I so appreciate Paul's transparency about his own weaknesses, his own struggles with the ugly stuff in life. "And his victories," Stella prompted when Arthur's voice trailed off. "Paul was victorious in Christ, and don't you forget that, you hear? Because that seems to be the direction you're heading now, right?" Arthur straightened on the bench beside her. "It is. You're absolutely right. And today is another victory for me, Stella. I'm so grateful you showed up today." "I am so grateful you reached out to me after all these years. You've done this old lady's heart a world of good. I've prayed for you many times since that encounter." Arthur nodded slowly, then said, "I think a lot of people have been praying for me over the years." He grinned at her. "We've reconciled, my parents and I, just so you know. They've been very supportive of me as I've worked through my addictions and the consequences of my past." "I'm glad, so glad." "If I could go back and undo everything I did and still be a changed man now, I would do it in a heartbeat." He shook his head and continued, "But honestly, I don't think I would have believed I needed change had it not been for the bottom of the pit I found myself in." He reached over and touched the back of Stella's hand, his fingertips cool against her thin skin. It was just a quick contact, but even in that slightest connection, she sensed his heartfelt desire for restitution. Stella opened her purse and withdrew the beautiful mahogany box she had carved for Roger. "Do you know where I was going that day?" Not at first. He blinked hard, and she thought he might be resisting the urge to cry again. "I had ducked into the alley that runs the length of the block behind the shops. I started rooting around in your things." His voice trailed off, as though realizing his words sounded crass and insensitive, but he took a quick breath and went on. "I didn't know what the case was at first, but I pulled it out and saw the label on the side, and even in my frantic state, I knew what I was holding." Then, at his request, Stella told him about that day, about the beautiful urn she'd been on her way to pick up. She handed it to him and watched him trace the pattern of the carving with his fingertips, reminding her of the way Sarah had done the same thing the first time she saw the box. And she told Arthur about Roger. It was so good to talk about her beloved husband with yet another person. And they had a good laugh over his shock at finding Roger's ashes. "Go ahead and laugh," Arthur said when she apologized for doing so. "It's funny now. Served me right, too, you know. When I realized what was in that container, I think I might have squealed like a little girl. I shoved it back into your purse and chucked the whole thing into the closest dumpster, then took off." He shook his head, remembering. "But when I got back to the place I was staying and found one of my buddies waiting for me, he was armed. I went back for it, hoping it was still there. I hadn't looked in your wallet for cash, and that's what I needed most." He smiled bittersweetly. "I thought it was your $500 that saved my life that day. How small-minded I was. How broken I was." "God weaves the most remarkable patterns, doesn't he?" Stella said, her voice quiet, gentle. "Roger would have loved this story and his part in bringing our two threads together." They sat in silence for a moment, then Arthur continued. "I want you to know, Stella, that when I went back for your purse and found it still there, waiting for me, well, it was as though God reached down from heaven and thwacked me in the side of the head with a baseball bat. I think I sat in that alley for almost 3 hours, wishing I was dead, wishing I was someone else, wishing someone would rescue me, save me from myself." He sighed and shook his head. "A woman came out the back door of one of the shops. She was on the phone, and when she saw me sitting there holding a lady's purse, I could tell she just knew what I'd done. And all I could think was that I needed to find you and give you back your purse. So I took off, headed back out to the crowded storefronts looking for you." He made a derisive sound. "I sounded like Marlon Brando from that streetcar movie, standing in the middle of the sidewalk yelling, 'Stella!' at the top of my lungs." "You didn't," Stella exclaimed, clapping her hands together at the thought. "I did. I hollered your name several times before I panicked and took off. I knew where you'd parked, so I was hoping to find your car still there." "You knew where I'd parked?" "Yes." Arthur grimaced and crossed his arms over his chest in a gesture that seemed more protective than defiant. "I saw you get out of your car. I saw how distracted you were." He sighed deeply and turned to look at her. "I chose you that day, Stella. I chose you because you looked like an easy target." He made a rueful sound. "Little did I know how dangerous you would turn out to be. I may have stalked you for 8 minutes tops. You, however, have hounded me for 8 years." Stella reached out and placed her hand on his crossed forearms and squeezed, gently, but with a rapidly growing fondness for the man. "I think it's been long enough for both of us." "Long enough, yes." Arthur took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp March air, and let it out slowly. Then he spread his arms wide and gazed up at the crystalline sky. Stella returned his smile with deep satisfaction when he said, "It's a glorious day, Mrs. Carnegie." At that moment, they heard the voices of the rest of their party returning from their tour of the butterfly gardens. Itzy, leading the pack, made a beeline for the fountain, one similar to the one at Pemberton Manor, albeit much larger. The child was simply unable to resist dipping her fingers into the cool, clear water in the basin.
"Come, you two bench-sitters. You have to put your hands in the water. It's for good luck."
Arthur turned to Stella. "Shall we?" When Stella nodded, he rose in that tall glass of water liquid manner he had about him and held out a hand toward her. "Allow me." Grace and Lucy approached, and behind them, walking a little slower, came Sarah, cradling the baby high in her arms. She swayed in time to a soft melody she hummed against Ollie's head. Pointing to different plants, to butterflies flitting overhead, she made a lovely picture of domesticity. Ollie, of course, being only 2 months old, was more fascinated by Sarah's face and voice than he was by all that she was pointing out to him. When Stella turned to glance up at Arthur, she found the young man was also rather captivated by what he saw. When they'd all obediently swirled their fingertips in the fountain, and had each given in to the temptation to flick icy water at each other, Arthur cleared his throat. "May I—" He started again. "May I take you ladies to dinner tonight?" Itzy poked him in the side.
"Baby Ollie is not a lady," she declared, placing her hands on her hips and glaring up at him.
Arthur took the reprimand in stride and crouched down in front of her so he could look her in the eye. "You're absolutely right, Itzy. Please accept my apology. I did not mean to offend you or anyone else here, including Ollie."
"I forgive you."
She cocked her head at him.
"So, exactly where do you want to take us for dinner?"
"Itzy!" Lucy reached out and put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. But the rest of the adults laughed out loud, and Arthur said, "That is a very important question. It's all right." He tapped a finger against his chin as though deep in thought. "Have any of you been to the old spaghetti factory?"
"They only have spaghetti there?"
Itzy asked. "Spaghetti and meatballs and all kinds of other yummy pasta meals," Grace explained. "Their macaroni and cheese is to die for." Itzy shook her head, a set expression on her face.
"Sorry, adults. I'm just not ready to die."
When the laughter had died down, Lucy explained the saying to her daughter, who then readily agreed that a pasta factory would be a great place to have dinner. Chapter 7. Several evenings later, alone in the comfort of her own quiet apartment, Stella went through the contents of her navy blue purse one last time. There was the usual assortment of things women carried around with them: several pens, lip balm, a travel-sized hand lotion, a nail file. She tossed it all, not even bothering to test the pens. Her wallet she'd keep. It had exactly the right number of pockets, an attached coin purse on the outside, and a clear windowed compartment for her driver's license that made it convenient to flash when someone needed to see her ID. Besides, it was a lovely soft blue that was also Roger's favorite color. He'd given it to her for Christmas 2 years before he passed away. When the bag was empty, she tucked it into a cardboard box in which she had started a collection of gently used items from her closet for a local women's shelter. The handbag was in fairly good shape, and even with Arthur's rough handling at the time of the theft, the straps had held, and Stella thought it would make someone else a fine bag. Roger's ashes were safely ensconced in the mahogany urn after all these years, and she'd set it on the top shelf of a floor-to-ceiling bookcase on one wall, where it would be safe from curious youngsters, but visible to anyone who wanted to remember Roger. No one else in her little circle — she had a circle — knew Roger, other than what she'd shared about him, but that didn't matter. Just like Itzy had said, Stella had lots of memories of her beloved husband, and no purse snatcher, reformed or otherwise, could ever take them away from her. She said a soft prayer, thanking God for the flood of miracles he'd brought into her life. I am truly a blessed woman. And God, if my Roger had anything to do with any of this, would you thank him for me, and tell him I think about him every day, and I miss him every day, and I love him always. The telephone rang, startling her. It took her a little longer than usual to get out of her chair. She'd had a lot of activity the last several weeks, between Itzy's regular visits, their rides in the Otis, sojourns out front to dip their fingers in the fountain, along with all the other things that were going on. But she made it to the phone before the last ring. "This is Stella." "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you." The voices chorused into the phone, and Stella smiled, delighted. She couldn't remember the last time anyone sang the happy birthday song to her. Not since Roger. "My goodness, girls, thank you. You're actually a day early, but how on earth did you know?" Stella asked when Grace and Sarah had finished their serenade. "Tell her, Sarah," Grace said, a note of smugness in her voice. They were on a speakerphone, but Stella could still hear the note of sisterly teasing in Grace's voice. "Well," Sarah said, drawing the word out like a dramatic teenager, "a little birdie told me." "You mean a tall, handsome, chivalrous gentleman birdie told you," Grace quipped. "Arthur," Stella guessed, but remained confused. "How did he know? And when did he tell you?" Grace chortled with delight, and when Sarah didn't immediately answer, she did. "Someone got a phone call today," she sing-songed, "and he let it slip that he'd seen your birthday on your driver's license. He asked Sarah if she thought it would be appropriate for him to bring you a gift tomorrow, and she said we'd find out. We're thinking maybe we should all take you out for a big birthday dinner so we can make a scene over you in public. One of those places where the waitstaff sings loudly and they give you a huge piece of birthday cake with a lit candle on top," Sarah added. Stella laughed at the exuberance coming through the phone. "No need for that," she said. but the idea sounded like so much fun. Nonsense, Sarah contradicted in her teacher voice. We are wining and dining you in style, Sarah continued. All of us. Arthur would like to take us all to that new steakhouse in town. Lucy and the kids, too. My goodness, that man is something else, isn't he? Stella said. I just hope he's not trying to make up for the past, she mused, although she didn't get that vibe from him. He certainly doesn't need to do so on my account. Grace chortled. Ha! I don't think it's the past he's trying to make up for, right, Sarah? Stop, Sarah demanded, but her giggle belied her tone. Someone has a date on Friday night, Grace crooned. It's not a date, Sarah insisted, but Stella could imagine the blush she was certain was coloring the young teacher's cheeks. I just broke up with my boyfriend, and I'm not ready to start officially dating yet, she explained. We're just going out for coffee. And dessert, at a real restaurant, not Starbucks. Stella chuckled. I'm going to have to agree with Grace on this, Sarah. Sounds willy-wather like a date to me. She pronounced it willy-wather the way Itzy did. She needed to get a cell phone, she thought. She loved the idea of being able to video chat the way everyone did these days, but up until recently, she simply hadn't felt the need to see or be seen by anyone she spoke to. Now, though, the thought of being able to watch Grace and Sarah in action, even if they were just a couple of floors above her, sounded like a lovely idea. Not that I've had much experience in the matter, at least not for many years. Was your Roger a good boyfriend? Grace asked. Stella had grown accustomed to the girl's direct questions. Oh my, yes. He was a wonderful boyfriend. We dated for only 7 months before he asked me to marry him, but I knew I'd say yes to him after the first week. She glanced over at the bookshelf where Roger's box sat, then closed her eyes at the wash of memories flooding through her. Feeling tired and a tad bit melancholy, she suggested, Maybe we can have tea and lemon cake again soon, and I'll tell you all about our courtship. Saturday morning? My place? Both sisters agreed, and then Grace added, There's something else. Lucy had a couple of cranky kids on her hands. She said Ollie is teething and keeping everyone up, so she asked me to tell you if I spoke to you first. I haven't seen her or spoken with her today. They got the guy, Grace exclaimed. They found what remained of Lucy's purse in the trunk of his car, along with a dozen or so others, so they had plenty to book the guy on. Oh, that's wonderful for Lucy, Stella began, but then thought of Arthur and how his life had changed when he'd snatched her purse. I hope the man gets the same kind of wake-up call as Arthur. Sarah and Grace both agreed, their voices solemn. But he's wanted for all kinds of other charges, Stella, Grace explained, not just for the purses. He's got quite a record, and it sounds like he's been in and out of jail several times. Stella said nothing for a moment as heavy sadness settled on her chest. Poor man, she thought, and then realized just how inside out her thinking had become since meeting Arthur. To feel such empathy for a thief, a man who would take advantage of and abuse the weak, the helpless. It made no sense at all, not in the world's eyes at least. But Stella thought perhaps God had used Arthur Radcliffe to give her a glimpse of the way God saw people, not as hopeless degenerates, but as his beloved children. We need to pray for that man, ladies. Grace and Sarah both laughed softly on their end of the phone. Itzy's already all over that, Sarah declared. She informed us today that although she knows we would all willy-wather not pray for the bad man, it is our Christian duty to do so anyway. She said that? Christian duty? Stella asked, laughing out loud, because in all honesty, she could clearly picture the little imp saying exactly that. "Yep," Grace chirped. "And yes, she included you and Arthur in on the mandate, as well as a few of the other residents in our building." "Well, good for her," Stella said. "That little girl is a force to be reckoned with, isn't she?" "That she is," Grace and Sarah both agreed. "That she is." "And what about you, Grace? Is there a young man you'd like to bring tomorrow night?" Stella asked. "It is my birthday, after all. The more the merrier, right?" If Grace could get away with being forthright, then so could Stella. "Oh, well, no." She was hedging, that was all there was to it, and Sarah's deliberate clearing of her throat only validated that. "Okay, well, there is, but he wouldn't come. Do you know Harvey Jones in apartment 2B?" Grace asked. Stella thought for a moment. Yes, I know of him. He's a mechanic, isn't he?" She paused, and then said in as delicate a tone as she could muster, "Would you like to invite Harvey to join us? I'd be happy to have him. I'm finding that getting to know my neighbors is really rather nice." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted only a second or two, and then both sisters giggled like schoolgirls. "Oh, no, Stella, not Harvey," Grace finally said. "Although he's a wonderful man, I do kind of prefer them closer to my own age. Especially since Harvey also happens to have a really rather handsome son who happens to be closer to Grace's age," Sarah declared. It was her turn to tease Grace. "Harvey has a son?" "Yes, he does," Grace said, her voice growing noticeably tender, making Stella smile. But there was something else there, too. Insecurity, perhaps? Doubt? Stella hoped the young man was worthy of the girl who seemed to go out of her way to care for others. "But August isn't really comfortable in public settings. He had a car accident a couple years ago, resulting in a head injury. He's still recovering, and busy places where the environment can be unpredictable is pretty tough for him still, and I don't want to pressure him to do things before he's ready." "I see," Stella said, nodding slowly. "Well, I'd love to meet him if you'd like to introduce me. Maybe one day soon." "That would be nice, Stella," Grace said. "I think you'd like him." Then she added, "I think he'd like you, too." "Well, ladies, I'm a little tired, so I think I'll call it a night. I'm so looking forward to tomorrow evening, though. Thank you. It's already the best birthday I've had in as long as I can remember. Thank you all, you, Lucy, Arthur, for sharing it with me." Sarah, her voice taking on a bit of a dreamy quality, added, "And thank you, Stella, for sharing Arthur with us." When they'd said their goodbyes, Stella simply sat, marveling anew at the way the good Lord worked. "And thank you, Father, for sharing such a lovely group of youngsters with me. I'm done with this whole sitting around and waiting thing. This old girl is ready for something new." She closed her eyes and smiled contentedly. "Happy birthday to me." We hope you have enjoyed our production of The Waiting Woman, Pemberton Manor, Book 4, written and narrated by Becky Dowdy. Copyright 2018 by Becky Dowdy. Production copyright 2022 by Becky Dowdy. This has been a Brave Hearts Press audio production. Thank you for listening.